Hello guys! Welcome back to Not Just Mecha. It's Marco here. In today's video we'll make the joy of every army and commission painter out there. And of course, Seraphon players. I need to stretch the speed painting muscles before tackling the scary mass of plastic inside Curse City. And Warhammer Underworld's warbands are great to get a good dose of instant gratification. Plus, I have to make a confession. In all my years of miniature painting, I never work on Lizardmen, and this is the perfect occasion to fill this gap in my collection with a set of cool, unique characters. We'll talk better about my speed painting philosophy during the video, but here is an overview of my process.
I give myself a defined, limited time frame to complete the work, and in this case, thanks to the uniform aesthetic of the warband, I plan to stay around the 3 hours of work. I plan every step before starting painting to maximize my efficiency, and I prepare all the colors and tools I need on the table to save even the smallest amount of time and to avoid artistic sidetracking. In order to create visual complexity, I divide the work in many super quick and super simple steps, and every phase has to push the model a bit closer to the final result. So I try to minimize the natural back and forth flow of classic painting, creating a more linear chain of events.
Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell button to always know what happens on the channel. And if you want to support my work, watch another video, like, comment, share, and maybe check my Patreon page. Patreon is what keeps the lights on, so if you like my content, consider joining the community, where you can find, for example, the real-time footage of my YouTube videos. Thanks a million, guys!
The skinks are really small, so I must be careful working on their tiny volumes, playing with high contrast to avoid losing the shape of the little muscles and their subtle masses. The chameleon has a totally different color scheme, but even if with different proportions, all its elements are repeated on the skinks. So with a good planning, this will not slow down the flow of the work. The Saurus has many elements in common with the leader, so I'll work them as the same entity. I start with a quick coat of black. Usually I start this kind of paint jobs with a color primer to immediately skip a step, but the color plastic of these kits always gives me some adhesion issues and a bit of tonal interference if I don't cover everything extremely well. So I prefer to start sealing the model with a simple coat of neutral black. I put a lot of thoughts in the choice of my first tone. The foundation of the scheme and what would have been my color primer in a standard grey plastic model is Molotov Burgundy. I chose this tone because, as you'll see later, it's the perfect contrasting complement for the light blue skins. It's a good shadow for the yellow feathers, and a great warm foundation for the gold elements. With a single, simple, uniform pass, I give to all the different elements what they need to stand out. Oh, and it's a perfect high contrast base also for the green skin. Then I shade my base tone using magenta ink. This is a real shading step, applied only on the parts facing down, to start building the progression of a simple, all-purpose zenithal light. Shading with a wash, you simply lower all the values without any sense of the light's direction and movement. The ink in its pot seems lighter than my base, but layering a couple of transparent passes, you immediately get a natural and soft transition into the darker values of a similar harmonious tone. Plus, the ink adds an interesting reptilian shine to the shadows that makes them deeper and even more in contrast with the next layers. To create the strong contrast I need to highlight the small volumes of these models, I jump to the main tone for the skins without intermediate colors or bridging steps. Golden High Flow Teal is an opaque tone, so it can easily cover even a much darker and contrasting value with a couple of thin layers. But thanks to its fluid formulation, it gives me space to modulate with the base the edges of the cone of sprayed paint, softening the strong transition. I carefully adjust the distance between the model and the airbrush, and I'm super gentle on the trigger. But my main source of control comes from the position and the angle of the model, that I move constantly to always get the best possible shot. I apply the same reasoning to the chameleon, but because of the higher transparency of light green paints, I first apply a layer of a solid bluish emerald green. Then, the real tone I want for him, using a powerful fluorescent green. As you probably noticed at this point, this process in its steps and visual output is just a zenithal value sketch, like the one we usually do in black and white at the beginning of the work. But here I opted to do it directly with colors, mainly because of the small size of the models, where layering is more efficient, striking, and easier to read than overlapped transparency effects. I use white ink to base the feathers. This is just preparatory work, so if you don't feel confident using the airbrush on these small details, you can do the same with a brush, without losing anything. But precisely because it's just a base layer, the stakes for trying are extremely low, still being a great training for your precision control on the trigger. I create the sensation of volume and its vertical movement, leaving in transparency some of the red as a subtle shadow. And I use a tiny bit of the same white to increase the spectrum of the light modulation on the blue skins. This layer is super transparent, so you don't perceive it like white, but just like a very light blue. I apply it also on the green chameleon in preparation for the next step. Again, every color must be applied everywhere needed a single time, when you have it ready in the airbrush or the palette, always pushing the models towards their final look. I needed white to support the extreme transparency of yellow ink, but even working with an opaque yellow, I suggest you a solid light base to boost its vibrancy and saturation. Yellow incorporates the sketch underneath, creating a smooth modulation with a simple, flat overlapping of paint. Similar idea on the green skin, that immediately gets a wider variety of tones, naturally flowing into each other in the smooth transition from magenta to yellow. And since I planned everything to work with an interconnected snowballing effect, this yellow and its modulation is the perfect base for the green shade. Because of the high content of yellow, green tones suffer the same lack of opacity and covering power, but working with this kind of layer transparency, they mutually boost their saturation and final visual impact. Same process and behavior for the orange shade. Using a fluorescent orange, slightly more opaque than the other two tones, I'm sure to obtain a vibrant, powerful, eye-catching color. And since I have it ready in the airbrush, I use a few delicate sprays to add even more complexity to the green skin, that now incorporates 6 different colors. Usually this is an overkill, especially for a speed painting process, but you can't save on tones painting a chameleon. A quick, light pass of grey on the bases is the last thing I can do with the airbrush, and all the remaining little elements and the general definition are a work for palette and brush. I base the metal parts with a mix of silver paints and a warm deep gold. I want these elements to create a soft contrast with the skin's cold tones, still maintaining a relatively neutral nature, that I can alter with transparent paints later to create different sensations or even totally different metals. Thanks to the light but richly modulated base I created for the skins, now I can use contrast paints to quickly work on the darker scales on their backs. I use Akhelian Green and Space Force Grey and a bunch of mixing glazing medium to create a fluid grey-blue that will set its tone in a couple of steps, easy to control. The medium adds body to the mix that prevents the watery paint to flow away from its target, making it easy for the brush to move around precisely, and the extra transparency is useful to control the opacity and saturation of the mix. I need this extra translucency also because this is not the only layer I want to apply on the scales. I add to the palette Volupus Pink and Magos Purple, and I use them slightly diluted with extra medium to lower the value of the scales, adding new tones and sensations at the same time. Again, the plan is to use many quick and simple steps, working all together to create complexity. I use the purple notes also on the chameleon to enhance the impact of the original warm tones in all the wrinkles and folds of the skin. These are basically quick glazes, made softening just a bit the strong impact of contrast paint with some medium. I use Plague Bearer Flash, Aggaros Dunes and Medium to create soft, transparent filters for the metal parts. The base tone is already a pale, warm gold, so I use Plague Bearer Flash to add extra character and saturation to specific parts. And Aggaros Dunes to enhance the volumes, using it to underline strong shapes, deeper lines and details, and everything facing downwards. I use contrasts also in their basic way to quickly set the red and blue patterns on the equipment of the priest and the Saurus. Fluid paints are great for this kind of precise works, because even if in general they seem more difficult to control, they are easier to use when you have a lot of details that can absorb the excess in their panel lines, minimizing the risk of mistakes. Time for adjustments and, more important, definition. And this is the full palette I'll use for the final steps. 2 tones for every major element give me a huge spectrum of new colors when mixing, and in general a good variety of hues and shades directly from the tubes, still keeping my options in a contained, harmonious palette. This is my first test of the new Hydration Membrane by Redgrass Games, that will come out in a Kickstarter next month. It's very different from classic palette paper, with a plastic finish on top that makes it washable and reusable, and it seems to control better the water's transpiration from the sponge. I'll let you know my thoughts after more experiments. Now all my painting is super smooth, because of all the airbrush layers and various coats of transparent colors. So my main priority in this stage is to introduce the sharp definition and the grit of the brushstrokes, with a full load of information they carry in every little line and dot. To push this concept to its maximum and compensate the look of this soft finish, I use every color and mix in its original consistency, without adding water or medium, or using just a little bit to help the mixing on the palette. The thick paint and its natural volume break the monotony, adding a ton of extra information. The use of different brushstrokes is the key to create a stronger sensation of different materials, different textures, and a general increased complexity. I use a thick stippling on the scales to suggest a roughness and an irregular, rocky feel. In few steps, this monochromatic layer adds a ton of depth thanks to the separation of the different levels and planes of the sculpt. I use the light, desaturated yellow to add structure and definition to the feathers. Here I use thin lines applied in the natural direction of the single fibers to create the illusion of their dimensionality. The color here is just a bit lighter than the base, because I want a low-key definition, where you can perceive the presence of a mass of fibers, but without really seeing the single elements in perfect focus. I want the weapons to look like sharp onyx, so I paint a greenish-blue pattern of irregular lines on the clean dark surface. Even if I imagine it as the same material, the pattern on the armor and the mace of the Zauros becomes more about dots and short lines, to render better the sensation of something delivering and receiving blunt hits. Teeth and claws are painted with thick skin tones, mixed from a base of yellow ochre and red. I use the undiluted paint and vertical brushstrokes to create the texture of the rough reptilian claws. I break the scheme of the cold skins, bringing back a bit of warmth with a light greenish turquoise. The paint itself is still thick here, but I use longer and more fluid brushstrokes to enhance the volume of wrinkles and the upper profiles of the muscles. Then I connect the two different finishes with little dots of lighter and lighter paint. I use pure yellow in the same way on the chameleon to add textures and little extra interesting elements. If you want to create the effect of a pool of water without the need of real depth, Tamiya clear paints are great to set the same kind of glossiness without messing with resins and their long drying times. The last step is to edge highlight the metallic elements. Metallic highlights are really powerful and easy to read even when painted in a quick, simple way. So I kept this definition for the last stage, because I like to modulate its sharpness based on the one I have on the rest of the model, to deliver a uniform effect without having unbalanced details arriving to the eyes with extremely different impacts. And here is the final result. 3 hours of extremely simple and relaxed painting to create my speed-painted version of the iconic heavy metal scheme for the Seraphon. Again, these are my first Lizardmen, so I wanted to test myself on a color scheme that I know since I was a child, but I never had the chance to really work with. I think that the funniest challenge in these models is represented by their scale and the size of the details you can paint and add in the many open surfaces you still have all around the skins and equipment. The choice of tones is of course specific to the models, but you can easily adapt and apply this same workflow on every other miniature.
If you like this video, give it a like and subscribe. Remember that you can ask me anything down below with a comment, and you can follow my projects during the week using one of my socials. And if you want to support the channel and my work, check my Patreon page and join the community, or maybe ask for a commission. See you next week, guys!